This is the podcast for week 4. We're on the legislature and the governor, those two chapters. So let's get started. The first question is what are the important functions of the legislature? Well, the most important function and is the first one here, making the law. Actually, that's the most important function of all government because the primary responsibility of government in general is to make public policy. And that particular function, making the law, belongs to the legislature, which should suggest to you that the founders or whoever wrote the Constitution, I always call them the founders, even when it's a modern Constitution, they had in mind that the legislature would be the most important branch. And you can tell by this particular function, control over making the law, prime responsibility for making the law. So, and keep in mind that they can make any law they want, anything that affects the common good, anything they think is necessary, can become law. The only limitation on state and local government is that the law they pass cannot violate the national constitution or the rights. More accurately, no law can violate the rights guaranteed to citizens by the national constitution. The second thing is to control the budget and finances. Again, when you look at a control over the finances, control over the money. Again, that should tell you that the legislature was designated by the writers of the Constitution as the primary government agency, the primary branch of government. Another thing that would also suggest that same thing is control over the executive branch. It is the legislature with the responsibility to keep track of not only the governor and the other executives at the state level, but also, as identified in the next point, control over the bureaucracy. So the idea of what's going on in the bureaucracy, whether or not the bureaucracy is following the public policy that the legislature intends it to follow. Those responsibilities, overseeing the executive branch and the bureaucracy, are handed to the legislature. So all of these are very important functions. And then the last one would be the judicial function, which would be things like impeachment, the responsibility to get rid of anybody in the government that's not operating according to constitutional mandates. That could be the governor, that could be other judges or judges at the judicial branch. It could be other members of their own branch. So you can see by looking at these functions that the legislature is in a position where they are giving a tremendous amount of power. You could also add there, I didn't put it in, but you could add that they have a representative function. It's their job to, carry out, in a sense, democracy by identifying what the public they represent, the people in their district or in the state. No, they're all represented by districts, whether you're in the Senate or in the legislature. Anyway, whatever people you that are part of your geographical district, what they want, what a majority of them want, and then put that into practice, attempt to get public policy to reflect that opinion. That's really carrying out the fundamental concept of democracy. So you can see from all of these things that the legislature is in a very important position. Okay, the second thing is, why is the legislature more powerful than the executive? kind of, if you look at the functions, compare the functions of the executive and the legislature, um, you can see that the legislature is given prime responsibility. The governor is more or less just an executive. He's somebody who's supposed to be um, responsible for carrying out the policy for the most part. What the governor has in addition, and we'll talk more about that as we go, but in addition, the governor participates in policy making by proposing a budget and then by the veto. So those are things that the governor participates in public policy. But if you compared it to certainly the prime responsibility for governmental action at the state level, local level as well, is the legislature. So why is it that they wound up with the power? Here are some of the reasons I thought about. One is they're trusted more by the founders. The founders, especially if the Constitution is old, at the state level or at the national level, the founders trusted the legislature more than they trusted the executive or the courts. They didn't see the courts as, at least in the early days of the republic, they didn't see the courts as making public policy the way they do today. But they primarily saw the political branches as being the legislature and the executive, and they trusted the legislature much more than they did the executive. They didn't like executives anyway because the power was too concentrated for them. They liked the idea, especially the founders of the country, they liked the idea of dividing power. And like I said, the primary concern for public policy was to place it in the hands of the legislature. So that's the group they trusted the most, thought would carry out democracy as they saw it. Second thing is they're given more formal powers to make the law and spend the money. We talked about that already. Certainly, the formal powers, if you look in the Constitution, the power to make the law and spend the money, which are the two fundamental powers, they're legislative powers and not executive. To some degree, like at the national level, not nearly as much as like the national, the executive has taken on more power. Primarily, that's because of public concerns. The public wants a strong executive, and so the more modern constitutions have done that. At the national level, it's done through the unwritten constitution, but at the state level, it's done primarily through granting the governor more powers in modern times. So in the 21st century, it's not all legislative power as it was in, say, the 18th or 19th century, but what we see is still the primary powers of government belong at the state level, even in the 21st century, to the legislature, not the governor. Another thing that designates the power as legislative is control over the executive appointments. I didn't really talk about that, but part of what the legislative power over the bureaucracy, control over the bureaucracy, control over the executive branch that we talked about in the first slide, have to do with appointments. The legislature has the power and the right to confirm any appointments that are made by the executive, and they make, at the state level, they make their own appointments as well to many departments and agencies. So control over executive appointments is really another way of designating or identifying, I should say, another way of identifying the legislative superiority over the executive branch. Control over the bureaucracy, we've talked about that a little bit. What they do, the way they have that control, the way the legislature has that control is they have committees that require executives of the bureaucracy to come and answer to them whenever they see a problem. So if they identify a problem like the bureaucracy at the welfare level has, say, corruption or something, where people are getting welfare who don't qualify, and people who do qualify aren't getting it because of political reasons or something along those lines, or there is some accusations of payoffs, people getting jobs simply because they're party members or faithful to a certain person in the party. They would investigate that. They would call in the top people, ask them questions, and come up with conclusions, which may most likely would lead to resignations and sometimes even criminal proceedings if people in the bureaucracy are doing things that are wrong. And then the last thing is they have the power of impeachment, and we talked a little bit about that. They can bring charges against anybody in the executive branch, anybody in the judiciary, any judge, for any kind of wrongdoing. Usually has to involve some interpretation of violation of the state constitution. And then the last thing would be their own members. So impeachment means anybody in the government that's doing anything wrong, they could impeach those people, and that ends their term in office. Okay, number 3 is why is the executive the weaker branch? The primary reason is the executive, which is the governor. Why is the governor the weakest entity, much weaker than the legislature at the state level? And this applies to the local level as well. When it comes to mayors, why are governors and mayors weaker at the state and local level? And the answer to that is, number 1, and this is probably the most important, is that they don't control the whole executive branch. The governor is in charge of some of the executive, but not all of it. Matter of fact, most of the important executives are elected, like the Attorney General, Secretary of State. Those are the 2 biggest ones. Controller is another one. Those people are all elected, and that means they're independent. Their office runs independent of the governor. So the Secretary of State, which is a huge operation at the state level, involving things like motor vehicle regulation. So if you want a driver's license or a chauffeur's license, and all of that kind of thing, keeping all the records of the state, not only driver's records, but who's got a driver's license and who doesn't, but also things like the other records of the state, like all the elections and everything else. So that the Secretary of State is a pretty powerful office, and you could do the same, go through the same kind of thing. We'll talk about it later. The other executives, like the Attorney General, the very powerful legal head of the state, represents the state in any cases. Those people are separately elected, meaning the governor has nothing to do with their office. So the governor might not like the way the Secretary of State operates, might not like the independence of the Secretary of State or the Attorney General, but there's nothing that the governor can do about it. They are separate. Those are separate offices, separate elected people, and as a result, that means there's no such thing at the state level or the governor's level of a cabinet. If you thought about, like you've seen pictures, I'm sure, of the President of the United States with a cabinet meeting, and all the different agencies and departments of the national government are represented at that table, and it's a huge table and a lot of people. If you were to have a cabinet meeting of a typical governor, it would be pretty sparse. That big table wouldn't be filled up at all. You have about 4 or 5 major departments, and that's it. The rest of the departments are controlled either separately elected, as I just mentioned, or they are controlled by the legislature. So that's what makes the governor weakest. That's the biggest thing. The governor is not in control of the executive branch. He's only in control, or she is only in control of a small part of it, or maybe about a third, probably be the best guess estimate for the average governor. It would be about a third of the bureaucracy. The rest of the bureaucracy either answers to the legislature or it's separately elected. Another thing, of course, is the governor cannot propose nor cannot spend money. For the responsibility for essentially for the budget and for the money, spending of the money, is in the hands of the legislature. They're the ones who control the purse, as it's called. They're the ones with the control over all of that. And as I said, it's limited bureaucratic control. The governor can't just order the bureaucracy to do something. We talked before about President Trump in his first 100 days operating mainly with the executive orders. That's really a decree. An executive order is a decree to the bureaucracy, telling the bureaucracy, this is what you have to do. And the governor really can't do anything like that, doesn't have that kind of power, because as we said, the bureaucracy is, for the most part, is in the hands of somebody else. So an executive order would be just a suggestion if the governor were to try that. Anyway, so that's why the executive is generally so much weaker at the state and local level than he or she is at the national level. Okay, the last one is, how does the governor compare with the president? And here you have all the different roles of the governor, for the most part. Commander-in-chief. Actually, when you look at the roles of the governor and you look at the roles of the president, you could say to some degree with all of these things, when it comes to roles, the first things essentially that are listed here, they both share in those powers, but the governor's role is much more limited. Like, for example, commander-in-chief, primary responsibility for foreign policy, that is to make war, even although it's in the Constitution, national Constitution, that Congress would be responsible for making war. That power has, through the unwritten Constitution, has been transferred to the president. So the president really makes war, and so all the military and all the decisions about foreign policy and everything, with deciding which country to go to war in, the war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, and so on, were all decisions made by the president. So when you talk about commander-in-chief, you can say that, a president has tremendous amounts of power, way more power than was ever envisioned in the Constitution by the Founding Fathers, because of this power over foreign policy. Now, if you look at the governor and you would say, well, what power does the governor have in terms of commander-in-chief? You could say the governor has control over the National Guard and can call out the National Guard in case of emergencies. So, for example, one of the common times that the National Guard is called out is if there is a prison riot. But any time that there's a problem where the local officials can't really handle it, they're not, state and local officials, I should say, cannot handle the problem, then it's possible that the governor would call out the National Guard. I remember, for example, when I was in college, I went to college in Iowa, as an undergrad, and the school was right near the Mississippi. It was right on the Mississippi. It was at that time it was Loras College, and so I went there, and they had a flood one year. I think I was a sophomore or a junior. I can't remember what year it was. It was a long time ago. Anyway, there was a flood, and the governor, in order to protect property, that people wouldn't get in a boat and go and raid the Sears, because all the different stores that were close to the river flooded during this particular period when the Mississippi River got real high and wound up flooding a huge area of the city. So in order to prevent people from going and looting, they called out the National Guard, and the National Guard patrolled and prevented people from stealing, although I'm not sure that would have happened. But anyway, that's the kind of thing that's done. Prison riots, the same kind of thing. Way back in the 60s when those kids were killed in the demonstration against the war in Vietnam at Kent State University, they were shot by the National Guard. So because the National Guard was called out because of the student protests and student riots that were happening, or students control. What students were doing was they were taking over administrative buildings in some of these big universities like Kent State, and the National Guard got called out, and horror against horror, they started shooting at unarmed kids. So anyway, the whole thing was such a mess. But that's the only control of the commander-in-chief by the governor. The second thing is chief legislator. Both can be said to do that. They propose legislation. There's nothing to prevent the president, or nothing to prevent the governor from proposing legislation. That's where you get the concept of chief legislator, and proposing a budget. But that's all it is. It's a proposal, because the legislature gets to decide how the money is going to be spent, which departments and agencies get that money and which don't. There are long time committees that meet to discuss the budget when it's in process, and it's not an easy kind of the rubber stamping kind of thing for the governor. It's a difficult task, and oftentimes the legislature, especially when the legislatures of the majorities of a different party than the governor, they're not likely to pass any major legislation that the governor proposes unless there's agreement on it. Chief of state, that means the ceremonial head of the government. To some degree, the president certainly is, the governor certainly is as well. The governor usually does many of the same things that the president does. So you're more likely to see the president in action as the ceremonial head of the government, greeting people who come to Washington, D.C., going to funerals and weddings and visiting other dignitaries, not just those that come to Washington, but going to see them when they take trips to foreign countries, greeting people who come to the White House, entertaining interest groups and agencies, and not agencies, but private groups of any type, charitable organizations and all that, who come to Washington. There are a lot of dinners and that kind of thing in Washington. Well, if you look at the governor does the same kind of things at the state level. Even at Christmas time, they light the Christmas tree, and they do the same thing at the state level. The kind of patterns after the president. It's just not as not as elaborate, prestigious, large, whatever ways you want to call it, for the governor. Chief administrator, we've talked about that. The governor really, like the commander-in-chief, the governor really doesn't compare because the governor doesn't control the whole executive branch. The cabinet meeting is maybe 4 departments, and that's all at the state level. Some states you'd say even less, because the of the reasons we mentioned, like separate elections of some of the other executive people, where the president has control over the whole executive branch, the whole bureaucracy. Head of the party, that may or may not be true. Actually, that may or may not be true of both the president and the governor. What you can say is probably, for the most part, both the president and the governor are the best fundraisers because they're the most noted people in the state. So they're usually pretty good at fundraising. And the president is really good at fundraising at the national level. Some presidents are better at it than others, depending on how popular they are. For example, I think the most popular fundraiser was President Reagan. But any president who goes to a party function, fundraiser where people are paying money to have a rubber chicken dinner or a spaghetti dinner, whatever it is, and take a picture with the president. Most of those people, almost any president, no matter what their popularity, can raise at least $1 million in one evening for that kind of thing. That's why when we see ex-presidents getting a lot of money for speeches that they make, we just saw in the paper that Obama was getting, I don't know, $400,000 for a speech. Unbelievable amounts of money. It's because they have big drawing power. Even as ex-presidents, they have big drawing power. So head of the party, they're certainly the best fundraiser. I'm not sure that in all cases that the governor, even the president, is really the head of the party. Somebody else may be, because they've been around longer, or because they're more significant in their party, or more people like them than they do the governor. But to some extent, they're party leader, and that's, like raising money is certainly part of the party leader role. Appointment and removal power. The president can appoint and remove almost every major person in the government, at least the people at the top levels, top 3 or so in each department and agency. The governor doesn't have nearly any kind of power like that. Veto power, yeah, the governor and the president are about the same in terms of veto power. As a matter of fact, the governor in some states, I think like about 21 states, has the item veto, where you can cross out part of the legislation and get rid of and keep the rest. Get rid of part of it and not all of it. And so in a sense, you could say when it comes to veto, the governor has more power than the president does, because the governor just has a kind of general veto. Administrative control, we talked about that. I mentioned appointment and removal twice here, and I don't know how this got in. All 3 of these on the right probably shouldn't be there anyway. We talked about them all already. So I think that wraps it up for this session.